Picture this: Marcus Johnson, a decorated Marine veteran, hanging freshly washed sheets on the clothesline behind his new home on a perfect Sunday morning. The spring breeze carries the scent of his grandmother's laundry soap recipe, the same one she'd used when he was a child, running through sheets that danced like ghosts in her backyard. The garden apartment complex is quiet except for birds and distant lawnmowers. Marcus breathes deeply, feeling at peace for the first time in months since moving back to his hometown after 15 years of service, until a shrill voice cuts through, his moment of tranquility. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing? This isn't some third-world country." Marcus turns to see a woman in an expensive jogging outfit standing at the edge of his yard, phone already in hand, her face a mask of indignation as if she'd caught him committing a crime rather than hanging his own sheets. "This is completely unacceptable," she continues, not waiting for his response. "I'm calling the property manager. This neighborhood has standards." Marcus opens his mouth to explain that the complex rules explicitly permit clotheslines in the private yard spaces, a fact he'd carefully confirmed before purchasing this home as part of his transition to civilian life. But the woman is already stomping away, furiously typing on her phone, glancing back with narrowed eyes that seem to say, "You don't belong here." Little did either of them know that this minor confrontation over laundry would spiral into a neighborhood saga that would leave one of them publicly humiliated and the other unexpectedly celebrated. Let me take you back to where it all began. Marcus Johnson had returned to Oakwood Heights 3 months ago, after completing his final tour with the Marines. 15 years of service, 4 deployments, and a Purple Heart had changed the skinny kid who'd left this suburban town, with nothing but determination and his grandmother's blessing. His military training and communication systems had given him specialized skills that translated well to civilian life, landing him a solid position with a cybersecurity firm that allowed him to work remotely 3 days a week. When his grandmother passed last year, leaving him her garden apartment in the increasingly upscale Oakwood Heights complex, it felt like she was still looking out for him from beyond. The place needed work, the appliances were outdated, the carpets worn, but the bones were good, and the private yard had been his grandmother's pride. She'd fought the Homeowners Association years ago to preserve the right to have clotheslines, arguing successfully that banning them was both classist and environmentally irresponsible. Marcus honored her memory by maintaining her garden, replanting her beloved roses, and keeping the bird feeders filled. He'd updated the interior with careful attention to energy efficiency, solar panels on the roof, a smart thermostat system, and water-saving fixtures. His neighbors on either side had welcomed him warmly, the Patels to the left bringing over homemade samosas, and elderly Mr. Washington to the right sharing stories of when he and Marcus's grandmother had been among the first black homeowners in the complex back in the 1970s. "Your grandma was a fighter," Mr. Washington told him one evening as they sat on adjoining porches. "When they tried telling her she couldn't hang laundry, she brought in newspaper reporters, said it was her right to use the sun and wind God provided instead of wasting electricity." Marcus laughed, picturing his tiny but fierce grandmother facing down the Homeowners Association. "That sounds like her." "You watch yourself, though," Mr. Washington added, his voice dropping. "There's a new element moved in across the way, paid cash for the biggest unit, woman named Patricia Westfield, been trying to change all the rules since she got here 6 months ago, wants to upgrade the community image, which seems to mean making it look like nobody actually lives here." Marcus had noticed the immaculately maintained end unit with the luxury SUV in the driveway. He'd even seen the woman Mr. Washington mentioned, always impeccably dressed, always frowning at something or someone. But their paths hadn't crossed directly until that Sunday morning at the clothesline. What Marcus didn't know was that Patricia Westfield had been watching him since he moved in. From behind designer curtains, she'd observed the moving trucks, the visitors, his comings and goings. She'd been the only resident to vote against his renovation proposals at the homeowners' meeting, claiming his solar panels would create uncomfortable glare and reduce property values. She'd even called security when his former Marine buddies visited for a backyard barbecue, complaining about noise and suspicious individuals. The day after the clothesline incident, Marcus was kneeling in his garden, planting new vegetables, when a shadow fell across him. "Mr. Johnson, I presume?" The voice was cool, professional. Marcus stood, wiping soil from his hands to face Patricia Westfield. Up close, he could see the expense in every detail. The subtle highlights in her blonde hair, the designer logo on her purse, the diamond tennis bracelet catching sunlight. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you with something?" "I'm Patricia Westfield, HOA board president." She didn't offer her hand. "I wanted to personally inform you that your display yesterday was in violation of community standards." Article 7, Section B clearly states that no laundry, clothing, or household fabrics may be hung so as to be visible from the street or neighboring properties. Marcus maintained his composure, years of military discipline serving him well. Actually, Ms. Westfield, there's a grandfathered exception to that rule for the original garden units. My grandmother, Eloise Johnson, helped establish that exception. I have the documentation inside if you'd like to see it. Patricia's smile tightened. Well, that exception may have been appropriate for a different era, but Oakwood Heights has evolved. We're voting next month to eliminate all such outdated allowances. In the meantime, I'd appreciate if you'd show more consideration for those of us who've invested heavily in this community. I've invested in this community too, Ms. Westfield. This has been my family's home for decades. She looked him over, from his gardening clothes to his soil-covered hands. Yes, well, investment takes many forms, doesn't it? Some more visible than others. With that, she turned and walked away, calling over her shoulder, "Do consider a proper dryer, Mr. Johnson. They're quite affordable these days, even on a limited budget." As she walked away, Marcus took a deep breath, tamping down the anger her condescension had triggered. He'd faced worse than entitled neighbors in war zones. This was merely an annoyance, he told himself. Nothing worth disrupting his hard-won peace. But Patricia Westfield was just getting started. The following week, Marcus found a formal notice from the HOA taped to his door, citing him for improper waste disposal. He'd left his composting bin visible from the street. 2 days later, another notice claimed his bird feeders were attracting vermin. When he installed a small bench under the oak tree in his yard, a third notice appeared, describing it as an unapproved permanent structure. Each time, Marcus responded properly through official channels. He moved the compost bin behind the garage. He installed special trays under the bird feeders to catch fallen seeds. He provided the receipts showing the bench was technically garden furniture, not a permanent structure. He remained unfailingly polite in his written responses and during the HOA meeting where he successfully defended each of his choices with reference to the bylaws he'd carefully studied. The problem, explained Vivian Chen, the property manager who had known his grandmother, is that Patricia has been pushing for a complete aesthetic overhaul of the complex. She wants to rebrand Oakwood Heights as a luxury community, and your grandmother's old-school garden apartment doesn't fit her vision. But she can't just make up rules, Marcus said. No, but she can make life difficult until people give in. That's her strategy. 3 homeowners have already sold to her friends. From her country club, she's building a voting bloc. Marcus wasn't the only target of Patricia's community improvement campaign. The Patels had been cited for cooking odors. Mr. Washington had received notices about his classic car, which he kept in immaculate condition, but which Patricia claimed was an eyesore. But Marcus seemed to receive special attention, with new violations appearing weekly. The situation escalated when Marcus hosted a small gathering for Veterans Day. 6 former Marines, 2 with visible disabilities, came to honor their fallen comrades in a solemn backyard ceremony. They shared memories, raised a toast, and Marcus played taps on the trumpet as the sun set. A tribute to brothers and sisters lost in combat. The following morning, Marcus found Patricia taking photos of his yard. "Is there a problem, Ms. Westfield?" he asked, maintaining his composure. "Multiple reports of excessive noise last night," she said without looking up from her phone. "Music, loud conversations, disturbing the peace." "It was Veterans Day," Marcus explained. "We had a small memorial for friends who didn't make it home." Patricia finally looked at him, her expression unmoved. "Rules don't take holidays off, Mr. Johnson. Neither do property values." That afternoon, a police officer knocked on Marcus's door. "Mr. Johnson? I'm Officer Rivera. We received a noise complaint about your gathering last night." Marcus invited the officer in, explaining the nature of the memorial. Officer Rivera, himself a former Army sergeant, nodded understanding. "Between us, this seems like an overreaction. The complaint mentioned suspicious individuals engaging in possible illegal activities. But I had to follow up." "Let me guess," Marcus said. "Patricia Westfield called it in?" "I can't confirm who made the report," Officer Rivera said, but his expression told Marcus he was right. As Officer Rivera was leaving, he paused. "You know, my grandfather used to live in this complex. He always talked about a woman named Eloise who stood up to the board when they tried to force everyone to remove their cultural decorations. Said she was the reason he could keep his Puerto Rican flag flying." "That was my grandmother," Marcus said. Officer Rivera smiled. "Then she'd be proud you're not backing down. Just document everything. People like your neighbor, they usually overplay their hand eventually." The officer's prediction proved accurate. Patricia's campaign intensified over the following weeks. She organized an architectural review, that specifically targeted the original garden apartments. She scheduled landscaping work that mysteriously damaged Marcus's grandmother's rose bushes. She circulated a petition to ban outdoor gatherings after 7 p.m. Marcus responded methodically. He began recording all interactions. He researched housing, discrimination laws. He connected with other residents who had experienced similar treatment, creating an informal alliance of homeowners opposed to Patricia's vision. And he continued to hang his laundry, a small act of defiance that he knew infuriated her. During this time, Marcus installed security cameras around his property, a normal precaution for a cybersecurity professional. He positioned them carefully to protect his privacy and that of his neighbors, focusing only on his yard and entry points. What he didn't tell anyone was that these weren't ordinary security cameras, but military-grade systems with enhanced night vision, motion detection, and audio capabilities he'd acquired through his professional contacts. If Patricia wanted to play surveillance games, he was better equipped than she knew. The cameras proved their worth sooner than expected. One evening, returning from work, Marcus found his yard in disarray, garden plants uprooted, bird feeders knocked over, and a spray of bleach across his freshly hung laundry. More disturbingly, someone had carved the words, "Go back," into his wooden bench. Marcus immediately checked his security footage. The cameras had captured everything. Patricia Westfield entering his yard while wearing gardening gloves, methodically destroying his property, and then making a phone call before leaving. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser had driven slowly past his house. Marcus downloaded the footage, made multiple copies, and then called Officer Rivera directly. "I've got a vandalism and potential hate crime to report," he said, "and I have the perpetrator on video." When Officer Rivera arrived, alongside a detective from the department's hate crimes unit, Marcus showed them the footage. Their expressions grew increasingly serious as they watched Patricia's deliberate actions. "She called in a false police report too," Marcus explained. "Probably claimed I was the one vandalizing property." "She did," confirmed Officer Rivera. "Said she witnessed a large black male destroying garden fixtures and acting erratically. That's a serious offense. Filing a false police report with racial implications." The detective took careful notes. "Mr. Johnson, would you be willing to press charges?" Marcus considered the question. "What I want is for the harassment to stop, and I want my neighbors to know what kind of person is leading their HOA." "Well," said Officer Rivera, "we have enough here for multiple charges. But before we proceed, do you have any history with Ms. Westfield that might explain this level of targeting?" "None beyond moving into my grandmother's home and refusing to conform to her idea of what belongs in this neighborhood," Marcus replied. What happened next surprised even Marcus. The detective made a call to her lieutenant, explaining the situation. After a brief conversation, she turned to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, we have reason to believe Ms. Westfield may have engaged in similar behavior in her previous community. There was an investigation of harassment against a Filipino family that was dropped when they suddenly moved away. We never had evidence this solid. With your permission, we'd like to execute a search warrant for her property." 2 days later, Patricia Westfield was arrested, not just for vandalism and filing false reports, but for what the police found in her home. Detailed dossiers on several minority residents in Oakwood Heights and 2 previous communities, financial records showing she'd been embezzling from the HOA funds, and evidence of identity theft targeting elderly residents like Mr. Washington. The story exploded across local media. HOA Karen caught red-handed, targeted black veteran in harassment. Campaign read one headline. Security footage of Patricia destroying Marcus's property while wearing her designer workout clothes went viral. Former residents from other communities came forward with similar stories of harassment that had driven them from their homes, allowing Patricia and her friends to purchase properties at reduced prices. At the emergency HOA meeting that followed, attendance was at a record high. Residents who had never spoken at meetings before stood to share their experiences with Patricia's community standards. The Patels described how their children had been made to feel unwelcome at the community pool. Mr. Washington revealed that his classic car had been keyed 3 times, incidents he'd previously attributed to random vandalism. Vivian Chen, the property manager, presented financial records showing how Patricia had diverted HOA funds to pay for landscaping that primarily benefited properties owned by her friends. "She was creating a system where only certain people could afford to live here," Vivian explained, raising fees while targeting specific homeowners with expensive violations. In a unanimous vote, the remaining board members removed Patricia from her position and elected a new, more diverse leadership team that included Marcus, Mr. Washington, and Mrs. Patel. Their first official act was to pass a community respect resolution that explicitly protected the rights of original garden apartment owners to maintain their properties in keeping with the complex's historical character. As for Patricia, she was released on bail pending trial, returning briefly to pack her belongings, under police supervision. Residents gathered on their porches to watch silently as she loaded her luxury SUV. When she passed Marcus's house, where freshly washed sheets hung proudly on the clothesline, she kept her eyes straight ahead. The media attention brought unexpected consequences. A historical preservation society reached out about designating the original garden apartments as culturally significant. A documentary filmmaker began interviewing residents about the community's evolution from its integrated beginnings to its current diversity. Marcus found himself reluctantly becoming the face of a larger conversation about housing discrimination and the subtle ways privilege continues to shape American neighborhoods. "I never wanted to be an activist," he told Officer Rivera, who had become a friend, visiting often to check on the case's progress. "I just wanted to live in peace in my grandmother's home." "Sometimes peace has to be fought for," Rivera replied, "like everything else worth having." In the months that followed, Oakwood Heights transformed. The community garden Marcus proposed was approved and installed in a previously unused corner of the complex. Solar panels appeared on more roofs. Clotheslines returned to several yards. Cultural celebrations became regular events in the community center, with the Patel's Diwali festival drawing participants from throughout the city. 1 year after the clothesline confrontation, Marcus stood in his flourishing garden, surrounded by neighbors for a community cookout. Mr. Washington had brought his famous potato salad. Mrs. Patel shared freshly made samosas. Children played on the community playground that had been renovated using the funds previously allocated for Patricia's aesthetic improvements. "Your grandmother would be so proud," Mr. Washington said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "Not just because you stood your ground, but because you brought people together instead of letting her drive them apart." "I had good teachers," Marcus replied, "both my grandmother and the Marines." Later that evening, as the gathering wound down, Marcus received an email from his lawyer. Patricia Westfield had accepted a plea deal, agreeing to pay restitution to the HOA and affected homeowners in exchange for a reduced sentence. She would serve 6 months in county jail, followed by 3 years probation, during which she was banned from serving on any HOA board. The email included a link to an article about Patricia's new living situation, a small apartment in a neighboring city where, ironically, line-drying laundry was the norm due to the aging building's limited facilities. There was even a photo. Patricia Westfield, without her designer clothes and professional hairstyle, looking tired and ordinary as she carried a laundry basket through her new parking lot. Marcus chose not to share the update with his neighbors. Some battles, once won, were best left in the past. Instead, he raised his glass in a toast. "To Oakwood Heights," he said, "where everyone's laundry deserves to dance in the breeze." The group laughed, clinking glasses, many unaware of the full significance of his words. But those who knew, Mr. Washington, the Patels, Officer Rivera, nodded in understanding. In the distance, sheets billowed on clotheslines in several yards, bright flags of victory against the setting sun. Have you ever witnessed someone like Patricia getting exactly what they deserved? Or maybe you've been targeted unfairly by an HOA or neighborhood busybody? Share your stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this true account of justice served, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories where entitlement meets its match. Remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't just exposing someone's true colors. It's creating a stronger community in the process.